The U.S. presidential candidates have dramatically differing views on immigration and diversity.
They're bringing drugs, they're bringing crime, they're rapists, and some, I assume, are good people.
Enough is enough. We will come together based on what we all know we have in common, and we will not let those people who are motivated by hate separate us or make us feel fear.
Are Americans as divided as the candidates? The election could provide the answers.
I think there is the tendency by some people to make a hero out of the 19th century immigrant, but not necessarily the 20th or 21st century immigrant. And to some degree that has to do with the racial remix of U.S. immigration.
Today is Friday, November 1st, and this is The Issue from VOA.
Hi, everyone. I'm Lori London.
And I'm Scott Walterman. America continues to become more ethnically diverse, and as it does, the white majority continues to shrink. It's become a major theme in the presidential campaign.
They hate our country because who would want to have millions of people coming into our country? Many of them are murderers, many of them are terrorists, many of them are gang members from the street MS-13 and almost worse. You know, the Venezuelan gangs are almost worse. And these countries are taking their prisons and they're taking their prison population, putting them in buses and bringing them to our border. Venezuela's got half their prison population has been brought to the United States of America and dumped like we're a garbage can. Like we're a garbage can for their people.
What Donald Trump has never understood is that e pluribus unum, out of many, one, isn't just a phrase on a dollar bill. It is a living truth about the heart of our nation.
With the election just days away, the outcome could signal the direction of the nation for years to come.
Race and immigration has become an extremely effective tool in the last couple of presidential and big regional elections here in the United States.
Right, and according to the polls we're seeing anyway, immigration is a very big issue, and a lot of people agree with former President Trump's views that immigration may be detrimental to the U.S. So there's such a division between the parties and Americans when it comes to immigration, and certainly racial issues have been coming up more and more as well.
So let's get some perspective on America's changing demographics and what it means for the country's future. Joining us now is Michael Ezra, a professor of American Multicultural Studies at Sonoma State University.
Thanks so much for speaking. I always appreciate your perspective.
You're welcome.
So we're in an interesting time here. We went from an African-American president to Donald Trump, and then the first Black American Indian vice president, and potentially now the president. And as America obviously continues to become more ethnically and racially diverse, we also seem to be more and more divided on the issues of immigration and race equality. Obviously a very big major theme in this election coming up in just a couple of days, and also a lot of hate, rise in hate crime. What do you think is happening here with our changing demographics?
Yeah, I think that when you look at the presidential election in the context of our world at the current moment, it might seem like the most important election of our times, or that the issues are unprecedented, or that, for example, hate crimes are on the rise. But if you were to compare the political scene now to 1880 or whatever, then it would seem like hate crimes, have been minimized over the years. And if you look at these elections in much larger contexts, you can see them as part of cycles. And I'm not sure right now if in 2024 we're going through some kind of racial realignment in which how different racial groups line up with the political parties shifts and changes at all, or if the current cycles will play out as they usually do in history.
When you say realignment, what do you mean?
It's hard to know actually who's going to vote how, and we never really truly find out because exit polling is limited. But historically, what we see now is that the Democratic Party gets about half, almost, a little less than half of its votes from non-white voters. And the Republican Party gets about 10% of its votes from non-white voters and about 90% of its votes from whites. At one time in U.S. history, the Democratic Party and the Republican Party essentially split the black vote. In 1960, Richard Nixon said, if I had only gotten 10% more of the black vote, I would have won this election. And he published an article saying that in Ebony magazine. So there was a time when the Republican Party had the idea that the strategy would be to peel off those newly franchised black voters in the 1960s and play off the animosity that black voters had towards the Democratic Party in the 1960s as the racist party. But then the Democratic Party realigned in the 1960s. It backed strong civil rights legislation behind Lyndon Johnson, who was, originally like a Southern Democrat. And as a result, the Republican Party was able to capture the legislation, and they joined the Republican Party, which then dominated election cycles for 20 years. You had Republican presidents in 5 out of 6 elections following Johnson's presidency. So that's what I mean by a realignment.
Well, in that regard, you can see Hispanic voters for sure drifting to the right.
So in 2016, if you looked at Donald Trump's original run for president, he was standing at 1% in the Iowa caucuses. And the Republican Party leadership, like the Republican National Committee, all of whom quit once Trump won, didn't back him at all. The Republican Party elite in 2016 backed 3 candidates that I can think of, the favorites. There was Jeb Bush, there was Ted Cruz, there was Marco Rubio. Cruz and Rubio's ties to Latino voters are obvious. Jeb Bush, though, also speaks fluent Spanish, is married to a Latina, majored in Latin American studies in college, did term abroads in Latin America. So he has strong ties to Latinos and was the governor of Florida, and you have to have some ties to Latinos to win that state. So the strategy of the Republican Party, I think, was to try to peel off as many Latino voters using conservatism as the common thread from the Democratic Party. But instead, what happened was that Trump's anti-immigrant message, and in some ways anti-Latino immigrant message, won the day with Republican voters. So that realignment got stalled. There is talk of some drift by Latinos towards Trump, but we don't know actually how the election is going to play out. But the Republican Party, if Trump loses, almost certainly will resume that strategy of not just playing to a white base, but trying to expand that base as the only way to stay competitive in national elections. They have lost the popular vote in 6 out of the last 7 elections, with only George Bush in 2004 winning. So this is actually a dire situation for the Republican Party in terms of mobilizing the national electorate. Issues that used to work for them, like abortion, which Reagan used to rally a 49-state win in 1984, is a loser for them in 2020 and 2022.
Right. And the rise in immigration and anti-immigration, talking about deporting millions of immigrants, just this anti-immigrant sentiment, it's sort of contrary to the founding of the country. If you look back, nation of immigrants, what would you say to people that, would be sort of a miscalculation as to the impact of immigrants on the country as a whole?
I think that unless you really study immigration and have your own metrics for what qualifies as progress or positive impact, it would be really hard for anyone to make a reasoned statement beyond their own personal ideology of what the overall net result of immigration has been to the United States in historical context as well as in the present. And I think there is the tendency by some people to make a hero out of the 19th century immigrant, but not necessarily the 20th or 21st century immigrant. And something to some degree that has to do with the racial remix of U.S. immigration. You had in the 1890s, early 20th century, up until like the 19 teens, about 90% of immigrants to the United States coming from Europe. And not all of them were accepted in equal measure. But nowadays, you have a reversal of it. About 90% of immigration to the United States comes from outside Europe. So you have kind of a different looking immigrant coming to the United States. You have the United States population changing in terms of white versus non-white. The census has been overcounting whites for quite a long time. Combined with differing birth rates and racial groups and immigration, you have a different racial mix of the United States. Whites will no longer be 50% of the population relatively soon. And why most Americans do believe that is not a negative per se, there is a portion of the electorate, about 10 to 20% of the electorate, more strongly correlating with whites, that does express openly fear of the changing racial demographic of the United States. And in Donald Trump's case, there is the belief, I think, of a lot of people that he doesn't like immigrants. And you hear even his initial run for president, the first speech that he does. And he talks about, some of them are rapists. They come from Mexico. They come from Asia. They probably come from the Middle East. So you would think Donald Trump, is anti-immigrant. But if you look at Donald Trump's personal life, all four of his grandparents came from Europe. 2 out of his 3 wives came from Europe. The people he surrounds himself with are immigrants. So Donald Trump seems to have benefited from and enjoys the company of immigrants from Europe, but not necessarily from other parts of the world. And that does indicate that, at least in some of his messaging, race has something to do, immigration in some ways is a stand-in for a racial worldview, a racial ideology.
Well, to pair that with what you were saying about early immigration from Europe, you hear that when people say, oh, well, they're Irish or they're Italian. Well, my people came in legally, but they did not. They got on a boat, they landed at Ellis Island, they applied for asylum, and then disappeared into Manhattan. It's the same thing, pretty much, that's happening on the southern border.
There are many parallel myths between how people speak about immigration back in the day, so to speak, and how they speak about it now. And right, there is the myth that everyone who came here, prior to 1924 or whatever, came here legally. And there is the idea that most people came here with nothing and yet still managed to make it. So why are we providing, safety nets for people who come here now? But the truth is that America needed immigrants to come in the early 20th century to help build up American cities and industry. And there were a lot of incentives for people to come, and a lot of people who may have come here perhaps undercapitalized came here with skills that what they were unable to practice and benefit from so much in their home country, but would be able to be a stonemason or a carpenter or a pipe fitter or a steel worker in the United States, where those kinds of opportunities for industrialization came slightly after European industrialization.
And now it seems like a portion of our population is vilifying immigrants as somehow taking jobs away from people. And it also seems like there's a rise in white nationalism, not just even here in the U.S., but globally, as well as, African American voters in particular being the target of voter suppression efforts that could, dilute their voting strength. Do you see that also as a factor in all of this?
Well, if you listen to some people, ultimately what this election will come down to is Democrats getting out the black vote. Generally speaking, voting rights experts do talk about a case called Shelby versus Holder from 2013 in the Supreme Court, in which an Alabama county was able to successfully sue to get tenets of the Voting Rights Act changed, which leads to closures of voting places and shorter hours or closures of DMVs, and in some cases voter ID laws that are somewhat difficult to pursue if you don't already own a government issued ID. It's not as easy as people would think. In 1/3 of Texas counties, you need an ID to vote, but those same counties don't offer any place for a resident of that county to get a government issued ID. So in places where there's like a narrow margin of victory or loss, like Atlanta, like Detroit, like Milwaukee, like Philadelphia, in those swing states, it's very important for Democrats to mobilize the black vote, make sure that no voters are suppressed, make sure that the lines keep moving, make sure that the machines work. But because there are so few places that actually count in terms of a narrow margin of victory deciding this election, just as a guess, I feel like, any major political party with an active legal branch and ties to the judiciary and a strong ground game sees what's coming ahead and knows what the general voter suppression tactics are and has countermeasures to battle them.
Last big picture question. You mentioned cycles, and I have this cycle theory where we become complacent over long periods of time, and every 40 or so years we face a crisis that we have to rise to. McCarthyism, Watergate, now. And we do. We rise as Americans to the occasion.
What is interesting to me during this time period is the kind of contradictory messaging that individuals, institutions, and let's just say groups of people exude. You have the Washington Post, whose slogan became in the Trump era, "Democracy dies in darkness," who then refuses to endorse. And I actually think one of the biggest stories of this whole election cycle is probably going to be the takedown of the owner of Amazon, who has been posing on a yacht with muscularity and with a very glamorous wife, trying to adopt a traditional kind of manly image, who instead shrunk from the challenge of Trumpism. And I think that kind of the parodying and lampooning of that kind of hypocrisy is going to play out over the next 4 years.
Right, because the editorial board was ready to endorse Kamala Harris, and then suddenly they were not allowed.
Yeah, the newspaper, has endorsed the candidate for quite a long time and now didn't. And that has raised eyebrows. And in terms of culture, 250,000 people canceling their subscriptions to the Washington Post in a matter of days, 10 to 12% of their readership. To me, that's actually a sign of energy on the left.
All right. We really appreciate your perspective. Thanks so much.
Oh, thank you very much.
Michael Ezra, professor of American Multicultural Studies at Sonoma State University.
It's such a complex conversation, Scott. We as we talked about in the interview, we've always been thought of as this nation of immigrants, and it's changing the demographics. That at some point, like you said, the Caucasian population will not be the majority anymore very soon.
It's an emotional issue. People sometimes need something to focus their anger on, even if their anger has nothing to do with what they're focusing on. They need a boogeyman, a bad guy.
Right.
Yeah.
And that just, it has to do with fear too. There's fear. And so if you point the blame, then you at least have somewhere to go with that anger, whether it's justified or not.
It is just human nature. That's all. It's human nature.
It is human nature.
This has been The Issue from the Voice of America.
On behalf of all of us here at VOA, thank you so much for joining us.
You can follow The Issue on X and Facebook at VOA The Issue. And for news 24/7, our website is voanews.com.
In Washington, I'm Lori London.
And I'm Scott Walterman.
We'll talk to you Monday.